It was a cold winter's night when Officer James Daniels received a call that would forever alter the course of his life. The call, a simple 911 dispatch, sounded ordinary at first: a domestic disturbance, an emergency at a house on Mulberry Lane, just outside the city limits. But as James turned his patrol car onto the snowy road leading to the scene, a feeling of dread settled in his stomach. James had been married to his wife, Sarah, for only 3 months. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, and their life together had been nothing short of perfect. Or so he thought. Sarah was beautiful, kind, and everything he had ever wanted. His father, George Daniels, a retired Army colonel, had welcomed her into the family with open arms. The bond between father and daughter-in-law had been strong, too strong in fact. The house on Mulberry Lane was dark, the lights of the porch flickering as James parked outside. He could hear muffled voices through the thick snow as he stepped out of his car, his gun already at his side. His heart raced, his thoughts drifting back to earlier that day, when everything had seemed so normal. He kissed Sarah goodbye before heading to work, never suspecting that in a matter of hours, his life would spiral into chaos. When James entered the house, he immediately noticed the broken front door, the wood splintered and jagged. His training kicked in, and he crept inside, calling out, "Sarah? Dad?" But no response came. The house was eerily silent. His eyes then landed on the living room, and the horror that greeted him was beyond anything he could have imagined. There on the couch was his wife, but it wasn't the sight of her that made James's stomach turn. It was the sight of his father. His father, George, was sitting there, with his pants unbuckled, and Sarah was on her knees in front of him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. A sickening mixture of rage, betrayal, and confusion flooded James's chest. His hand instinctively reached for his service weapon, his fingers trembling. Without thinking, he fired. The first shot rang out and Sarah collapsed to the floor, a loud gasp escaping her lips. Before he could register what was happening, his father too was on the floor, blood pooling around him. James' vision blurred and his hands shook uncontrollably as he fired again, this time at his father. The horror of what he had just done consumed him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. In a blind rage, he bolted from the house, leaving behind the carnage. But the story didn't end there. The next few hours were a blur for Officer James Daniels. He didn't stop running until his legs could no longer carry him. He had no clear destination, no plan, just an overwhelming need to escape. His mind was in turmoil, replaying the moment of discovery over and over again. The image of Sarah, his wife, kneeling before his father like that, was burned into his brain. His breath was shallow as he struggled to control his racing thoughts. By the time he found himself at a quiet park, sitting on a cold bench, the adrenaline began to wear off, and the magnitude of what he had just done began to sink in. He had killed two people he loved, two people he trusted. But why? Why had Sarah betrayed him? Why had his father, his own flesh and blood, been involved? These questions gnawed at him, but answers were elusive, lost beneath the fog of his actions. James sat in the park for hours, the snow continuing to fall around him, blanketing the world in a thick silence. His hands were still shaking, his shirt stained with blood. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he couldn't bring himself to check it. He didn't want to hear the questions. He didn't want to explain anything. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that he finally decided to face the reality of his situation. His father and wife were dead. His career was over. His life, as he had known it, was destroyed. There was no escaping what he had done. Back at the house, the police were already swarming the crime scene. Detectives and forensics teams were combing through the living room, collecting evidence. The paramedics had arrived too late to save either Sarah or George. Both victims were found with multiple gunshot wounds. Sarah had been shot twice in the chest, and George had taken 3 shots to the torso. Detective Rachel Lawson, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, was assigned to the case. She was known for her sharp instincts and unrelenting pursuit of the truth. As she surveyed the scene, she felt something wasn't right. This wasn't just another domestic dispute gone wrong. There were too many inconsistencies, too, many unanswered questions. For one, the blood spatter seemed off. The angles of the shots didn't align with the positions of the bodies. If James had been the shooter, he would have been standing directly in front of Sarah when he fired the fatal shots. But the pattern suggested the shooter might have been somewhere else, perhaps off to the side. Rachel's suspicions grew as she observed the scene more closely. There was also the matter of the broken door. It looked like it had been kicked in from the inside, which didn't make sense if James had been the one to enter the house. And the biggest clue? The 911 call had never come in from the house. No one had reported the disturbance. Had James planned to kill them all along? Or had something triggered him in that moment? Rachel wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. The situation didn't add up. Detective Rachel Lawson stood in the middle of the living room, carefully examining the scene. She had seen many murder cases in her career, but there was something about this one that felt different. The brutality of it, the personal nature of the killings, it made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and her instincts as a seasoned investigator told her not to rush to conclusions. She turned to her partner, Detective Mike Turner, who was standing by the front door, scrutinizing the broken frame. "Something doesn't sit right with me," Rachel said, her voice low. "The angle of the blood spatter. It's not what you'd expect from a straight-on shot. It looks like the shooter was standing at an angle, almost like they were aiming from the side." Mike raised an eyebrow. "You think it wasn't James?" "I don't know," she replied. "It's hard to say, but I'm not convinced. We need to dig deeper. Let's start by looking at James's alibi and his state of mind. If he's guilty, we need to know why. And if he's not, we need to find out who else was involved." The forensic team had already gathered the physical evidence: shell casings, bullet trajectories, and blood spatter patterns. But there was one thing they hadn't yet figured out: the broken door. From the outside, it looked as though someone had forcibly entered the house. If James had been the shooter, why would the door have been broken in such a way? Wouldn't he have just walked in if it was his home? Rachel made a note to check the lock and examine the door frame in more detail later. In the meantime, Mike headed out to talk to the neighbors and get a clearer picture of the family dynamics. He would also try to get a statement from the 911 dispatcher who had taken the call, as there was no record of anyone calling from the house. James Daniels was already in custody when Rachel and Mike returned to the police station. He had turned himself in at the local precinct hours after the shooting. His clothes were still stained with his wife's blood, and his face was pale, a mixture of shock and remorse etched into his features. He had barely spoken since his arrest, only muttering a few broken sentences when they asked him what happened. Rachel sat across from him in the interrogation room, her notepad resting in front of her. She studied his face for a moment before speaking. "James," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night." He looked at her, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hands were trembling on the table, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I don't remember it all clearly," he began, his voice shaky. "I came home, and I heard noises inside. The door, it was already broken when I got there. I went in, and then I saw them. I saw Sarah with my father. I don't know what happened after that. He choked on his words, unable to continue. Rachel leaned forward, trying to keep the conversation focused. "James, you need to tell me what you saw. Did you shoot your wife and your father? What happened after you fired the first shot?" His eyes welled with tears. "I don't know. It all happened so fast. I was so angry I couldn't think straight. I just saw them together, and it was like everything I thought I knew was a lie. I shot her, and then I shot my father. I couldn't stop." Rachel wrote down his words, but something still didn't feel right. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the anguish in his voice. But there was no mention of anyone else being involved. He was taking full responsibility for the deaths. But was that the truth? "James," she asked gently, "are you sure there was no one else in the house? No one else you saw? Could anyone have come in after you arrived?" He shook his head, his face a mixture of confusion and desperation. "No one else, I swear. It was just me." Rachel's instincts told her that James might be lying, but she couldn't yet prove it. She needed more evidence, more time to dig deeper. After the interrogation, Rachel and Mike convened in the break room. Mike looked at Rachel, his brow furrowed. Something doesn't add up. He's not acting like a man who's guilty. He's not even trying to cover up his tracks. Rachel nodded, her mind racing. I agree, but we have to be careful. If he's lying, there's a reason. We need to find out what it is. They both knew that the case was far from over. And as Rachel stared at the file in front of her, she made a silent vow to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. As the days passed, Detective Rachel Lawson delved deeper into the investigation. There were still too many loose ends, too many inconsistencies that couldn't be ignored. James Daniels had confessed, but his demeanor, the look of guilt and confusion in his eyes, gnawed at her. It was almost as if he was hiding something, something more than just a jealous rage. Rachel began by revisiting the crime scene, hoping to uncover something new. The forensic team had finished processing the evidence, but Rachel wasn't convinced that all the angles had been explored. As she stood in the living room again, her mind replayed the details. The broken door, the blood spatter, the angle of the shots. If James had been the shooter, why had the door been kicked in from the inside? Why didn't it match up with the story James had told? Rachel crouched down beside the door, examining the jagged edges of the broken frame more closely. It was a subtle detail, but she had a gut feeling that this wasn't the work of someone entering the house. The door's damage suggested it had been kicked in from the inside, meaning it was more likely that someone had tried to escape. Or worse, someone had been trapped. Rachel's thoughts were interrupted when Mike Turner walked in, holding a stack of papers. "We've got some new information," he said, his voice serious. "I spoke to the 911 dispatcher, and there's something off about the call." Rachel straightened up. "What do you mean?" "The dispatcher told me that the call came from a payphone, not from inside the house, and it was made just after the shooting, about 15 minutes after the bodies were found. James never called in, but someone did. They hung up before anyone could ask questions." Rachel frowned, her mind racing. So, someone else was there. Someone else knew what happened. Mike nodded. "Exactly. We've also got a few other pieces of the puzzle. The neighbors didn't hear anything unusual, but they did see a black SUV parked in the driveway earlier that day. They couldn't identify the person driving it, but they saw it leave shortly after the police arrived." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. A black SUV? That didn't fit the profile of James or his father, who both drove sedans. Who had been in that SUV, and why hadn't James mentioned it? "There's more," Mike continued. "I checked the security footage from a nearby gas station. The black SUV pulled in just before the shooting, and it was driven by a woman. I couldn't get a good shot of her face, but we've got a license plate number." Rachel's mind raced. A woman. But who? She couldn't recall James ever mentioning anyone other than Sarah in his life. He had always spoken highly of his father, but now it seemed like there were secrets buried beneath the surface. "We need to track down that SUV," Rachel said, her voice tight with determination. "Find out who the woman is. If she was there, she might know something we don't." Later that day, Rachel sat in her office, her phone pressed to her ear as she listened to the results of the vehicle search. The black SUV's license plate had been traced to a woman named Lila Carter, an alias, as it turned out. Lila was a private investigator with a criminal record. She had been in contact with George Daniels, James's father, in the months leading up to the murder. The pieces were starting to fall into place. George Daniels had hired Lila to keep tabs on his son and daughter-in-law, and from the look of things, it wasn't just about surveillance. Rachel suspected that George's relationship with Sarah was more complicated than James had known. The plot was thickening, and it was starting to look like there was far more to this case than a simple crime of passion. Rachel didn't waste any time. She contacted Lila's last known address and set up an interview. When she arrived at the dingy apartment complex, her instincts told her that this was the break they had been waiting for. She knocked on the door, her hand steady despite the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. Lila opened the door, a cigarette dangling from her lips. "I know who you are," Lila said before Rachel could speak. "I'm not here to play games. If you're looking for answers, you're not going to find them in my apartment." Rachel pushed past her and stepped inside. The apartment was sparsely decorated, with just a few pieces of worn furniture scattered about. A stack of papers on a nearby table caught Rachel's eye, and she quickly skimmed them. They were case files, files detailing surveillance on George, Sarah, and even James. It was all there in black and white. "I'm done with this," Lila spat, flicking her cigarette into an ashtray. "I didn't sign up for this kind of mess. Your precious little officer shot up his family, and now he's trying to make it look like someone else was involved. He can't handle the truth." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What truth?" Lila gave a hollow laugh. "The truth about what George was doing. You think he was just being a protective father? You're wrong. He was trying to control everything. His son, his daughter-in-law, their lives. And when Sarah started seeing someone else, well, that's when everything went to hell." Rachel's mind whirled. Sarah had been having an affair, but with whom? And how deep did George's manipulation go? Lila leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. George was trying to make Sarah his. He wasn't just her father-in-law. They were involved. And when James found out, he went crazy. Rachel's stomach turned. The pieces were finally coming together. George's twisted obsession with Sarah had led to the explosive confrontation. But it wasn't just a simple betrayal between father, son, and wife. It was a darker, more insidious web of manipulation, obsession, and lies. Rachel felt the weight of Lila's words settle like a stone in her stomach. The truth had been hidden, buried beneath layers of lies and betrayal. She stared at Lila, trying to process everything the private investigator had just revealed. George Daniels, the respected war hero and beloved father, had been involved with his daughter-in-law, not just as a protector, but as a lover. The thought made Rachel's blood run cold. Lila flicked her cigarette butt into the ashtray and crossed her arms. "You want the whole story? Fine, but you're going to hate it." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "Tell me everything." Lila leaned back against the wall, her eyes distant, as if she were recalling a past she'd rather forget. "George hired me to keep tabs on his son and daughter-in-law after they got married. At first, it was just to make sure James was staying loyal, that he was focused on his career and his marriage. But then things started changing. Sarah, she wasn't happy. She wasn't as into James as he thought she was. I saw her with another man once or twice, but it wasn't just anyone. It was George." Rachel felt her stomach twist. "So, George was having an affair with his own daughter-in-law?" Lila nodded slowly. "Not just an affair. They had been sleeping together for months before James found out. The only reason they didn't want anyone to know was because it would ruin everything. James's career, George's reputation, and the family. But once James found out, well, that's when things got messy. George tried to convince Sarah to stay quiet, to keep it all hidden, but she wanted out. She didn't want any part of it anymore. And that's when James came home that night." Rachel's mind was racing as she pieced the details together. It made sense now. George had manipulated Sarah, and when she started distancing herself from him, he lost control. And when James found out, he was caught in the middle of a devastating triangle, unable to cope with the truth. "So James didn't know about the affair until that night?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. Lila shook her head. "Number? He had no idea. He thought his father was just a protective old man, trying to keep his family in line. But the truth hit him like a freight train. He didn't know who to trust anymore. His wife was on her knees in front of his father, and it broke him. He just snapped." Rachel's mind reeled as she considered the implications of what Lila was telling her. If James had killed his father and wife out of jealousy and betrayal, that might explain his confession. But Lila's story was pointing to something darker, something that painted George as the mastermind behind the chaos. Rachel had to know more. She needed to understand the full extent of George's involvement and why Lila had been hired in the first place. "Why did George hire you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Lila shrugged. "He didn't trust anyone else. He thought I was the only one who could keep tabs on his son without raising suspicion. I didn't ask questions, but I could see what was going on. He was obsessed with Sarah, and he knew if anyone found out, it would ruin everything. So he kept me on the payroll to keep things quiet. But it was all about control for him. And when Sarah tried to break free, he couldn't let go. Rachel was starting to see the bigger picture now. George wasn't just a victim in this twisted family drama. He was a manipulator, a man who had used his position of power to control the people around him. His actions had set the stage for the explosive confrontation that had ended in murder. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. Why hadn't James told the police about Lila? Why had he omitted so many details in his confession? Lila, why didn't James mention you? Why hasn't he said anything about his father's involvement with Sarah? Rachel pressed. Lila's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. James didn't want anyone to know the truth. He was embarrassed, ashamed of what he'd walked in on. And I think he was in denial. He couldn't accept that his father, the man he had always looked up to, was involved in something so vile. He never wanted anyone to find out, least of all the police. Rachel let that sink in. James's confession wasn't just a result of guilt. It was a desperate attempt to shield his father's legacy, to protect the man who had manipulated him all his life. He had been broken by the truth, by the betrayal of the two people he loved the most. But that left Rachel with more questions than answers. She had seen James's pain in the interrogation room, the depth of his emotional turmoil. Was he guilty of murder, or was he a victim of his father's manipulation, pushed to the edge by the weight of betrayal? The next morning, Rachel and Mike sat in the precinct, going through the files once more. The case was shifting under their feet, and the lines between guilt and innocence were becoming increasingly blurred. "I've been thinking," Mike said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "What if James didn't actually kill them? What if someone else was involved? It doesn't make sense that James would shoot his father after he already shot Sarah." Rachel looked up from her files. "You think someone else came in after the initial shooting?" Mike nodded. "Yeah, think about it. James comes home, he sees the betrayal, he loses control, he shoots Sarah. But then, when he turns on his father, maybe George fights back, and that's when the second shooter comes in." Rachel's eyes widened. "You're right. James said he shot both of them, but there's no way to know for sure. He was too emotional, too out of control. We need to get more information on George's background. Find out who might have had a reason to kill him." Mike stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'll take care of it. I'll dig into George's past, see if there's anything about his military service or any enemies he made over the years." As Mike left to continue his research, Rachel sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. She had always believed in the simplicity of the truth. But this case was anything but simple. The days following Rachel's revelation in Lila's apartment felt like a blur. The case had taken a dark turn, and Rachel knew they were only scratching the surface. The more she dug into George Daniels' past, the more disturbing things she found. The man she had once believed was a respectable pillar of the community, a hero with a clean record, was nothing of the sort. Mike Turner had come through. He had unearthed a series of old military files from George's time in the service. The more Rachel read through them, the more unsettling the connections became. George had been a decorated officer in Vietnam, but it wasn't the medals that caught Rachel's eye. It was the long list of dubious activities and encounters. There were hints of corruption, allegations of mistreatment of fellow soldiers, and reports of questionable dealings during his time stationed overseas. It wasn't public knowledge, and the military had swept most of it under the rug. But now it was clear. George Daniels had a history of using his power to manipulate others. But that wasn't all. Rachel also discovered several legal documents detailing George's involvement in a secretive real estate deal that seemed to go under the radar. The deal involved purchasing land at a fraction of its value, with a shadowy group of investors behind it. One name in particular stood out: Lila Carter, the same Lila who had been hired by George to keep tabs on his son and daughter-in-law. Rachel frowned as she examined the paperwork. Was it possible that Lila was more than just a hired gun? Could she have had a personal connection to George? A reason for her loyalty beyond just money? She leaned back in her chair and called Mike. "Get over here. I think we've missed something big." Mike arrived an hour later, his face grim. "What did you find?" "I've been going through George's old military records, and I found something that doesn't add up," Rachel said, her voice tense. "There's a connection between George and Lila, But it's not just professional. They've been working together on a shady real estate deal, and it's all tied to a group of investors who've been under investigation for years. We need to figure out what Lila's real role is here. Mike's expression grew darker. You think she's been pulling the strings all along? I don't know, Rachel replied. But I don't think she's just some random private investigator. There's something bigger at play here, and George is at the center of it. The next step was clear. They had to bring Lila in for questioning again. Rachel's instincts told her that she wasn't being entirely honest, and it was time to get the truth. But when they arrived at her apartment, they were met with an empty, darkened space. The door was slightly ajar, and the room inside was completely abandoned. Lila was gone. Damn it, Mike muttered, kicking the doorframe in frustration. She's gone. What the hell is going on here? Rachel's mind raced. Lila's sudden disappearance wasn't a coincidence. She had been involved in something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. And now she had gone into hiding, likely because she knew the walls were closing in on her. She wasn't just running from the police. She was running from something or someone else. We need to find her, Rachel said, her voice cold and determined. But first we need to figure out who's backing her. Who's behind this whole mess? Mike nodded and they headed back to the precinct. Rachel opened her case file, her eyes scanning the notes they'd gathered so far. There was one last piece of the puzzle that still eluded her. George's connection to the other people in his life. There had to be someone who could help them understand why George had gone to such extreme lengths to control his son, his daughter-in-law, and now possibly even Lila. Rachel's phone rang, cutting through her thoughts. It was an unexpected call from an anonymous source. Detective Lawson, the voice on the other end said, distorted by a voice modulator. If you want to understand everything that's happening, you need to look into the Daniels family's past. Start with George's old friends, the ones he left behind when he came back from Vietnam. They know more than you think, but be careful. Not everyone wants this story to come out. The line went dead before Rachel could ask any more questions. Who was that? Mike asked, his brow furrowed as he watched Rachel's expression darken. I don't know, Rachel said, her mind already spinning. But whoever it was, they've just given us a lead. Rachel and Mike wasted no time tracking down George Daniels' old friends. They managed to find a few who were still alive, but none of them seemed willing to speak freely about George. It wasn't until they reached out to a retired Army officer named Tom Jensen that they started to get real answers. Tom had served with George in Vietnam, and he was reluctant to talk at first. But after some coaxing, he finally broke. George changed when he came back, Tom said, his voice shaky. Before the war, he was a good man, a man of honor. But after what happened over there, something broke inside him. He wasn't the same, and I'm not sure if he ever was after that. Rachel pressed him for more details, and Tom revealed something shocking. George had been involved in illegal arms deals during his time in Vietnam, working with a network of shady individuals. It was that network that had helped him get his hands on the property deals he had used to amass his wealth when he returned to the U.S. But George had never truly severed ties with these people, and now it seemed they were part of the bigger picture, part of the reason he had resorted to manipulating his family. The truth is, Tom continued, George wasn't the man you think he was. He wasn't some loyal family man. He was always about power. He used his family, his position, to control everything around him. He never wanted anyone to know the truth. Rachel's stomach tightened. So, you're saying George was involved with people like Lila from the start? Tom nodded. Lila was just the tip of the iceberg. There's more you don't know, Detective. A lot more. And I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better. Rachel sat back in her chair, the weight of the truth sinking in. George Daniels, hadn't just been controlling his family. He had been living a double life, surrounded by dangerous people, and now his past had caught up with him in the worst way possible. She was closer to the truth than ever before, but she also knew that the danger was far from over. Someone didn't want this story to get out, and they would stop at nothing to keep Rachel from uncovering the rest of the secrets. But Rachel wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding the final piece of the puzzle. The investigation had reached a boiling point. Everything Rachel had uncovered so far, George Daniels's dark past, the connections to shady figures, and the twisted web of manipulation involving Lila, had painted a chilling picture. But now as the pieces started to fit together, Rachel knew the end was near. The final confrontation was inevitable, and she wasn't sure who would walk away unscathed. The call had come late the night before. The anonymous tipster had given her a name, William Ralston. He was the man behind the real estate deals, the arms dealings in Vietnam, and the shadowy figures who had been tied to George. A name Rachel had never heard before, but now it seemed everything was leading to him. Mike had immediately started digging into Ralston's background, and it didn't take long for them to discover that he had been a close associate of George's for decades. They'd been involved in criminal enterprises during and after the war, using George's military reputation as a shield to hide their illegal activities. But as the years passed, George had distanced himself from Ralston, cutting ties after a falling out over a failed deal. Or so Rachel had thought. But as Mike pieced together more information, it became clear. George hadn't severed ties with Ralston. He had just gone underground, continuing to work with the man in secret. Rachel sat at her desk, reviewing the final piece of the puzzle, a recording she had obtained from a confidential informant. It was a conversation between George and William Ralston, discussing a deal involving the same shady investors they had been tracking. The conversation was about money, power, and control, words that echoed everything Rachel had already learned about George. But there was more. The recording had a chilling moment. In it, Ralston said, "You know, George, when your son finds out what we've been up to, things will go sideways. I'm not sure he's going to forgive you for everything." George's voice responded, cold and calculated. "He'll never find out. And if he does, I'll make sure he stays quiet." Rachel's blood ran cold. That conversation wasn't just about business. It was about keeping secrets, about silencing people who knew too much. Rachel had always suspected George had been manipulating his son and daughter-in-law, but now she knew it was more than that. George wasn't just controlling his family for personal gain. He was trying to protect himself from being exposed. And when James had found out the truth, he had become a liability. James Daniels had been caught in a trap of his father's making. The betrayal had shattered him, but the murder, it had been the breaking point. The explosive moment when everything came to light, and James couldn't take it anymore. He had shot Sarah in a blind rage, but the second part, the part that involved shooting George, was something more. James had seen his father as a hero, as a man who could do no wrong. But in that one awful moment, George had shown him that he was nothing more than a manipulator, a man who had ruined everything in his pursuit of control. And when James shot George, it had been an act of rage, but also an act of rebellion. He had broken free from the man who had controlled his life for so long. Rachel leaned back in her chair, exhausted but resolute. The truth was clear now. James hadn't killed his wife and father out of pure jealousy or rage. It had been a culmination of years of manipulation, secrets, and betrayal. George Daniels had created a perfect storm of lies and deceit, and James had finally snapped. The next morning, Rachel called James back into the station for one final round of questioning. He had already confessed to the murders, but there were still holes in his story, questions that needed to be answered. When James sat across from Rachel in the interrogation room, his eyes were hollow, as though the weight of his actions had finally broken him. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together in front of him. "James," Rachel began, her voice soft but firm, "I know what happened that night, but there are still things you're not telling me, things that go deeper than what you've confessed." James looked up, his face pale, his voice a mere whisper. I didn't want to kill him. I didn't want to do any of this, but when I saw them together, when I saw what he did to her, to me, I lost it. And then, when I turned on him, I don't even know anymore. I don't know who I am." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes steady on his. "James, I need you to listen to me. You didn't just kill them because of what happened that night. This was about everything your father did to you, to Sarah, to everyone. You've been living in his shadow your whole life, and when you found out the truth, it shattered you. You couldn't handle it." James's eyes filled with tears. I loved him. He was my father. And now I've killed him. I don't even know how I'm supposed to feel." Rachel nodded, her voice softening. "You're not alone in this, but you need to understand that the weight of the world on your shoulders wasn't yours to carry. Your father, he made you carry it. And now we have to make sure the truth comes out. People need to know what really happened." James sat back in his chair, his gaze distant, lost in the memory of the night that had destroyed everything. The trial was a blur of emotions and revelations. James's defense was built around the idea that he had acted in the heat of the moment, that the shock of discovering the truth had driven him to commit the murders. It wasn't a complete defense, but it allowed for some leniency in the charges. The jury, torn between sympathy for the man who had been manipulated his entire life and the brutal act of violence he had committed, eventually found James guilty of manslaughter, not murder. His sentence was reduced, but he would still spend years in prison. As for George, his secrets were finally exposed to the public. His manipulations, his betrayal, and his dark dealings came to light, forever tarnishing the legacy he had spent a lifetime trying to protect. The real estate empire he had built crumbled, and his name became synonymous with corruption and deceit. Lila Carter was never found. The police believed she had disappeared into the underworld, leaving behind a trail of destruction. But her connection to George, and possibly to the shady investors he had worked with, remained an unanswered mystery. Rachel sat in her office late one night, staring at the case file. The case that had started as a simple murder investigation had unfolded into a dark tale of betrayal, manipulation, and violence. She had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? James had lost his family, his future, and his sense of self. George had lost everything he had built, his reputation shattered beyond repair. And Lila, the mysterious woman who had been at the heart of it all, remained an enigma. Rachel sighed, closing the file. The case was over, but the questions lingered. Some answers would never come, and some secrets would remain buried forever.